If you're like me, when I was growing up, I couldn't wait to get outside into the woods or wherever to go exploring with my brother. Now, I remember those days so fondly, and guess what? My kids were just like me. Today's guest, Dr. Doug Mader, felt exactly the same way, and he still does. When he was younger, his brother and him, they explored the Florida Keys, and his love for the wild things, they never changed. In fact, they may have been stronger today. His dad, who happened to be in the military, got stationed in Hawaii, and there he got to explore all the wild things there on the island. Now, fast forward several years, and he became a veterinarian. And not just any veterinarian, today he specializes in exotic animals, but that's just some of his story. He is also a chart-topping author. He's the author of The Vet and Noah's Ark. Now, do you remember Rodney King at all? For those who don't, in the early 1990s, Rodney King was captured on video being beaten by the police in LA. This caused riots in LA all over the place. So imagine this. You're a veterinarian in the middle of all that turmoil, but animals, they still need assistance, even during troubled times. Now, I bet you're asking yourself, why is he bringing this up? Well, Noah's Ark was a clinic and it was in the center of all this. And Doug's book captures what it was like to be a veterinarian during all those crazy times. Not only is the book just a great read, this episode gives more of Doug's whole story. You get to know him a bit personally, and it's really going to make you want to go out and get the book. So sit back and enjoy our guest, the vet and Noah's Ark, Dr. Doug Mader. We are supported by PrepVet, providing stem cell therapy for pets.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to the For Real Podcast. Today I've got a great guest. I've been dying to talk to him, and then when I started doing some reading, I realized him and I have crossed several paths but never met. I want everybody to please welcome Doug Mader, Dr. Doug Mader, but more importantly, he's got a new book that's coming out. He's done so many different things, exotic animals. Doug, I'm going to let you talk, but I could talk forever just introducing you, but please, thanks so much for joining and welcome to the show.
Oh, Mark, the pleasure is mine. I appreciate the opportunity to get on and chat with you and your audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. What I'd like to do is I'd like to dig into your background. Let's go, we've talked a little bit about it, but let's kind of get to where you got today. I definitely want to talk about your book, and I want to get into all the exotic animals you've done and all that. So let's just, tell me your life story and let's go from there.
Yeah, sure. I'll be happy to do that. It's fun. It's funny too, because, you just mentioned to the listeners that, we two trains passing in the night. I was actually born in the Florida Keys. And so I grew up traipsing around the swamps with my older brother, catching frogs and snakes and, watching birds, and just really, really, I felt like I was a wild child being part of nature. And so this goes back many, many decades. And at the time, the country was involved in Vietnam War. And my father was a soldier, and Uncle Sam sent him to the war to go fight the war. And when they did, they moved our entire family to the island of Hawaii, or to the state of Hawaii, to the island of Oahu. And they had us living on a military base there because that was the hub in the Pacific, of course, for all the military action. So when I got there, there are no snakes in Hawaii. And I'm a huge reptile lover and a huge snake lover. So that was very disappointing. But I did kind of get involved with a lot of the local wildlife as much as I could. But the meat of the story is this: I had an older sister who loved horses, and she kept her horse at the military stables on the military base. But the rules were that the father of the family had to do 4 hours a month on work day to help maintain the stable. And that meant fixing the fences, mowing the lawns, that kind of thing, right? Well, my dad was off fighting the war, so my mom made me, since I was quote unquote the man of the house, she made me go to this stable to do all the work so my sister could keep her horse. Well, I was in high school. I thought horses were stupid. Last thing I wanted to do was support my sister and all of her silly friends. But hey, mom said, go do it. So I went and did it. And you know what, Mark? I went to the stable and I noticed that there were a lot of really pretty girls. Keep in mind, I'm in high school, right? So
Yeah, of course.
that's kind of a priority. So it's like, whoa, this is really cool. But they all looked right through me because I wasn't a surfer. I wasn't an athlete. I was kind of a nature nerd, right? I just loved animals.
Right.
Anyway, so when I was there doing the work, kind of looking at all these pretty girls, and again, they all were looking right past me, I noticed that they were all watching the blacksmith. And here's this blacksmith who was a couple of years older than me. And he would be out there without his shirt, shoeing the horses and having all the muscles and the sweat. And the girls would all be hanging around him, bringing him sodas and just fawning over him, right? So I'm thinking, I can do that. So when I was 15, I moved away and I went to Arizona and I learned how to become a blacksmith. I went to a trade school. Then I went back to Hawaii and just so I could be with my mom and my sister. And I started shoeing horses. And all of a sudden, like, hey, girls think I'm pretty cool, right? So this was neat. I really like this. So, okay. So I started liking horses. But the best part was this, Mark. The veterinarian that would come out and work on the horses, his name was Dr. Tucker. He would have a horse that was limping and he'd say, hey, Doug, could you make this special shoe for me? So I would custom make a shoe and I'd fit it to the foot with the horse under the direction of the veterinarian. And then we would take these horses that were kind of destined for the glue factory and I could make them walk again.
Wow.
And I'm going, this is really cool. I can fix these horses, And then I'm looking at the veterinarian, I'm going, I can do that. Horseshoeing is back-breaking work. Oh my God. Fortunately, I was young and strong, but I'm looking at it and I'm going, I'm not going to do this the rest of my life. So I want to go to vet school. So that's kind of how it all started, Mark, is basically some pretty girls and trying to flirt. Didn't work. Learned how to shoe horses. Met a veterinarian. He gave me the book, James Herriot's book, All Creatures Great and Small. And that sealed the deal. I read that book and I just said, this is it. This is what I want to do. I'm going to be a horse veterinarian. I'm going to go to veterinary school. I'm going to take care of horses. And someday I want to write a book just like this because I don't know if you ever read his books, but he's a phenomenal writer and just a great storyteller.
I have read all Creatures, Small and Large. I have read that. That's a great book. Well, it's funny. I talk about this on the podcast every now and then. You never know when you go down a path where that journey is going to take you, and that's exactly what it took you. And it took you to UC Davis, which we have some commonality there too.
Well, it's definitely it's the Harvard of veterinary schools. I was incredibly fortunate to be able to get in, and to tell you what, I'm not that smart, but growing up in Hawaii, and I'm sure things have changed over the years, but at the time, pretty much if you just showed up to class, you got an A.
Sure.
And so I had straight A's coming out of high school, so that's why I got into Davis because I had a really good GPA. But when I got to Davis, I had the wake up call.
Right.
And all of a sudden I was at a university with everybody had straight A's, but they actually came from schools where they had to study. And so it was a shock for me to go to a university like that where, oh my God, you had to go home and put 4, 5, 6 hours of homework in every single night, even just to keep up with the basics,
Right.
So it was good for me. But, my whole goal was I wanted to be an equine veterinarian. I wanted to be an equine surgeon. And, I always had that hidden passion, that hidden fire for exotic animals, especially the creepy crawlies, the amphibians and the reptiles and
Right.
slugs and birds and things like that. And then when I was in graduate school, I got a graduate degree in animal behavior. One night during finals, I had just finished finals in graduate school, and my one of my roommates also had finished their finals, and so we decided we were going to go to a movie. And it was on a Saturday night. It was a midnight movie in Sacramento. And you got connections with Davis. You're familiar. Davis is kind of it's set off by a 10-mile long causeway over the rice fields and the floodplains.
Sure.
And so it's just a very long, skinny, narrow bridge. And we were coming back from the midnight movie about 2 in the morning. And keep in mind, this was before the days that seatbelts were mandatory. And I told my passenger, my friend, I said, hey, put on your seatbelt. She goes, oh, I hate seatbelts. And I go, yeah, it's Saturday night, middle of the night. Everybody on the road's drunk. Please put on your seatbelt. So she puts on her seatbelt. We're driving back across this bridge, and these two young kids, they were underage, they were drunk, they were drag racing. One of them lost control and rear-ended the back of my Volkswagen at about 110 miles an hour
Wow.
and sent me down the causeway in a ball of fire. And that just a year and 11 surgeries later, I couldn't work with horses anymore. I just couldn't do it. I didn't have the strength.
11 surgeries?
Yeah, I'm I'm over 20 now, just because I have so many chronic injuries from that crash. But it took 11 surgeries in a year to get me back on my feet. So I had to put off going to vet school for a year. But I did eventually get back. But during that year, I couldn't sit idle. And I'd already read all 4 of James Herriot's books. And I started volunteering at the zoo ward at the university just to keep myself busy. And I kind of go, you know what? This is cool. I can work with I can work with zebras. They're kind of like horses, but I don't have to be strong with them. I can anesthetize them first, and then I have other people help me. And I can work with elephants. I can work with snakes. I can work with tigers. I can work with all this crazy stuff.
That's cool.
But, everything is basically done with sedation, because you can't handle this stuff awake.
Right.
And that's kind of how I morphed from horses into exotics. So I studied the exotics and got my degree, and then I went on and did a master's degree. I got the master's degree in behavior, and then I went and did a residency program in primate and zoo animal medicine. And so when I got out, my thought at the time was I wanted to be a zoo veterinarian. As you say, things kind of keep morphing and changing as you go along, right? Which is
And by the way, just to add something, the kid that didn't study in high school now is getting master degrees and all this stuff too. So you actually could study, you just didn't know you could.
yeah. Well, you learn. There's an actual process called learning to learn.
Right. I believe that.
Yeah, and if you want to learn, you can teach yourself how to learn. So it was just something that I had to pay for my own schooling. I didn't have any financial support. So, I was working full time and then studying. And so you learn how to be really efficient and focused. And I think you end up being a better student when you keep yourself busy. So anyway, make long story short, I ended up taking a job at the university after I finished my residency program doing university veterinary work, but I hated it because it was all administrative.
Mhm.
And I'm really a hands-on. I wanted to be a surgeon. I wanted to, be a clinician. And one of my very, very good friends, who had also recently graduated, was working for another friend or working for somebody down in Southern California. And he and I decided, you know what? Let's be our own bosses. Let's buy our own place. And that's kind of where the book, The Vet at Noah's Ark, starts.
Right.
And it's when my buddy Willie and I start looking for a place to practice. So we ended up being in Southern California in the inner city, not too far from the coast. We bought this practice and we built it from it was a one doctor practice. We kind of built it from nothing and lived in a really sketchy, dangerous area without a parking lot and walking in.
What town was that?
What time it was? Right. We actually bought it. We started in 1989,
Okay.
and so it was 3 years or 2 years before the book started. The book starts in 91.
So, and what part of the city were you guys in?
It was in South LA on the north side of Long Beach.
Yeah, I know exactly where that is, the hood.
Yeah. So on one side, it was really an eclectic client base. Literally 2 blocks in one direction were the Heights, and at the time, Governor George Deukmejian was the governor of California. His wife used to bring her cat to us, and 2 blocks in the other direction was the poorer neighborhood, and we would have families coming in that couldn't even afford shoes for their kids. So I mean, we had a little bit of everybody as clients.
So you were kind of surrounded by I guess Signal Hill and Wilmington and Carson and all that stuff too?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Signal Hill was just off to our east, and then Carson and Wilmington were a little bit to the north. And we were only about maybe, I don't know, 5-10 miles from the epicenter of the riots when they started.
Yeah.
But they spread down to Long Beach in no time. I mean, our whole street, starting about 2 blocks from our office, pretty much burned down.
Yeah, before we started recording, I was living, I worked in Torrance at the time, which was right next to all that stuff too, and it was insane what was going on during that time, the whole Rodney King thing.
Yeah. So the book basically is about being a veterinarian. The book is about the human animal bond,
Right.
and that's what you do. I mean, you celebrate the human animal bond every time you have a podcast, and it's a powerful, powerful bond. And it extends. People always laugh and tease me because how can you have a human animal bond with a snake or a frog? Well, you can. I mean, I have a pet frog that was 18 years old and it died of cancer, and it probably would still be alive today if it didn't have cancer. And yeah, okay, so I don't sit on the couch and watch TV with my frog in my lap, but every single day I say good morning to it. I turn on its light, I clean its cage, I feed it, I talk to it. It never talks back to me. And, when it's gone, all of a sudden there's a vacuum, there's a void.
Sure.
And people don't realize that unless you've had that experience. And so, I've always loved exotic animals, and having done all the extra education, I always liked to teach. And that was always extremely important to me. I love teaching. And I also think if you want to get good at something, you need to teach it, because if you teach it, you've got to be better than everybody else.
You do, and you need to understand it.
Yeah. So I always had a student program. We sponsored students from different veterinary schools all over the country, and occasionally from students from other countries. So again, if you have students, you've got to be on your game. But one thing that I noticed was when I go to teach at these conferences, now here I am, I've got a veterinary degree, I've got a master's degree, I've got a residency, okay? I go to teach at these conferences, I wasn't board certified. And most of the people who speak at conferences have to have a board certification. And at the time, there was no board certification in exotic pet practice. There just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I did have the credentials, I had the resume, I had the publications, I had everything I needed. I just didn't have the title. So basically, the book starts when I decide I want to sit for my dog and cat specialty exam so that I can become a board certified specialist, just like all these other teachers. I'll still do my exotic stuff, but I'll be a specialist.
Right.
And so the book basically starts with me putting my application in the mail. It takes about a year to have your application accepted and then get what's called credentialed, where they vet you to make sure that you have the publications, that you have the training, you have the experience. And they really check it out. And then you have to take this test, which was 2 days, like 500 questions. Pretty amazing. So the book starts with me basically submitting my application, and then it ends basically a year later when I sit and take the test. And it's what happens in between running this veterinary hospital in the inner city, and then also happened to be the same year as the civil unrest surrounding the Rodney King case. And for the listeners that aren't familiar with it, it's kind of like a very sad deja vu. And yes, it was in the early 90s, but you take away the date and it sadly could be any big city anywhere in USA.
Right now in particular.
Yep. There was an incident where a gentleman, he was pulled over by the police and they sadly beat him badly. And it was before the days of cell phone videos, but somebody actually had a video camera. And they saw the lights flashing, heard the noise, ran out on their patio. They videoed the whole thing. He gave the video to the local news station, and then it went viral.
Yeah.
And then that just sparked the whole unrest across the entire country. And the riots actually started right after the police that were accused of the beating got off scot-free. None of them were found guilty.
Exactly. Yeah, I remember.
And then everything burned to the ground.
It was crazy. It was just a crazy time.
So, during that, in the meantime, we're trying to run a hospital and save lives. The staff showed up. Pretty much everyone except for me, I think, had a gun. We took turns sitting on the roof, boarding up the windows, had the fire hoses ready. The whole block that we lived on, pretty much all of the residents on the block, the business owners, took turns sitting on the roofs. Several of them had guns, long guns, shotguns, rifles, things like that. The rioting and the burning and the destruction ended about 2 blocks from the street that we practiced on. So we were very lucky that we didn't have any damage to the hospital. And unfortunately, we did have, I don't want to be a spoiler, but we did have one of my clients was killed right outside the hospital, and one of my employees was stabbed
Yeah.
by the rioters.
Writers, yeah.
So it was pretty intense.
Well, one of the things I like about the book, aside from the fact that you're going through that inner city stuff, is what you address. But most people don't know when you go to a vet that they're just like everybody else, and the struggles you have to go through, and just as an example, you trying to get board certified, you're going through all this stuff while you're also taking care of people's animals. So people don't tend to know that. So I think it'd be what I like about the book. The advantage I have, I'm kind of in between. I'm in vet clinics all the time, talking to vets and get to know them personally. And there's a lot more to it than just taking care of your animal. So I think it's a well read, it's a good book for everybody to read to kind of understand that. And everybody's an animal lover that's on this show anyway. So that's great.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's let's just say do you have any dogs or cats? And I probably should know this.
I have two. Well, I've had animals my entire life. I have two rescues right now.
Okay, so you bring one of your rescues to the vet, and at the time you were in that exam room with that veterinarian, that's your whole universe,
Right.
and that's the veterinarian's whole universe. This everything, nothing else matters. It's just we're here to help you and promote that human animal bond. Sometimes we can't. We all want to walk on water. God, I'd love to save everything, but the reality is that's not reality.
Right.
And sometimes it means making sure that as you're approaching the end of that human animal bond, it's done with dignity,
Yeah.
and it can take a toll. Obviously, it takes a toll on the owners, but there's something called compassion fatigue, and it can take a toll on the veterinarians and the veterinary staff as well. And you considering I've been doing this for about 4 decades now, and you think of all the animals I've saved, that's great and it makes me happy. But the ones that I remember are the ones that I lost.
Yeah. Those are the painful ones.
Yeah.
I always talk, and this is what you're talking about too, about the human animal bond. One of the things advantage that I've had from doing the podcast, it's an awareness thing, right? What I've learned and continue to learn is how they are so similar to humans, even though they're our partners that we're living with. But they have the same diseases, they have all these other things. I've had somebody on that, and it's just been recently diagnosed and actually being treated, even though it makes sense, as PTSD in dogs. It's only really
Mhm.
in the last 10 years that they've really been spending time on there. But it makes sense. If you take a step back and say, well, they're going through the same things we're going through, but we never think about that because they're our pets.
Right.
So, and you see it on a day-to-day basis based on what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean they have all the same feelings and emotions that we do. They just can't articulate them the same. But as a pet owner, you can read your pet's body language, so they don't have to
Sure.
sit there verbally and tell you, "Dad, I'm scared."
Oh, yeah, yeah,
You can see it in their eyes. You can see it in their behavior. You can see it in everything that they do.
yeah. So let's keep your story. So you're in there, you survived that thing, survived the riots, but then you decide to get out of LA, which I did too. So, then let's take your journey from there.
Yeah, so I stayed there for another 6 years, about 5 or 6 years. And then I decided it was time to make some changes. And I was born in the Florida Keys. And I mentioned that in the beginning of our chat,
Sure.
and how I used to love the environment in the swamps here. And I also love to dive. So I learned how to dive in Southern California. And it's beautiful. Diving in the kelp forest is just spectacular.
Or Catalina too.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
Yeah, Catalina. I mean, it's beautiful. You just walk right off the shore and you're in 80 feet of water,
yeah.
swimming through the kelp. You feel like you're in some aquarium. The water is crystal clear. You got sea lions, you got sharks and fish, and it's amazing. But you're also wearing a 7 mil wetsuit and 20 pounds of weight.
Yeah.
So in the shortly after the riots, my wife and I decided, you know what? Let's go diving in the Florida Keys. I want to go back and visit the place where I was born. And when we're there, we'll do some diving, because the Florida Keys has spectacular diving. The difference, of course, is that the water temperature is 80 degrees and not 55. So we flew out and it was amazing. It was like I'd never left.
Yeah.
And we spent the whole week underwater, and I said, you know what? I love it here. This is where I was born. This is where I want to come back. So basically, I went back to California with the intention of at some point moving to Florida. And then, you know how life is. They throw speed bumps at you here and there, and
Sure.
I hit a bunch of speed bumps and I figured, okay, it's time. So we went ahead and I sold my practice in California, and then I moved to the Florida Keys with basically no job. There were the Florida Keys, for the listeners that aren't familiar with them, it's an archipelago of islands. There's 43 islands attached by 42 bridges, starting in Key West, and that's the bottom of US Highway 1. So that's mile marker 0 on the map. And then you follow US Highway 1 all the way up the east coast of the United States to the very, very, very tip of Maine. And I want to say that's around mile marker 2,600 or something. It's quite a long way away. So the Keys are 120 miles long before you reach the mainland up where Miami and the Everglades are. So I got 120 miles long and about a quarter mile wide.
Mm-hmm.
So there are already too many veterinarians here. And the chances of opening up a veterinary practice were pretty slim because there were already way too many vets. But when I had come out on one of my many forays to the Keys and, to do diving and recharge my batteries when I needed to get away from LA, I met this gentleman named Richie Moretti. And Richie Moretti was a retired Volkswagen mechanic. He, extremely good businessman, made a lot of investments. He ended up buying a small motel in Marathon, which is an island about halfway between Key West and Miami. And fodder for another podcast, he basically started the very first sea turtle hospital in the entire world.
Wow.
And the olden days, we didn't have fresh water in the Florida Keys. So if you wanted a pool for your hotel guests, you dug a big hole, and then the water would fill in from the bottom up with tide water. So it was salt water. And then when the tide went out, the pool went down. When the tide came in, the pool went back up. And so he had this huge tidewater pool that was used for the guests. And he loved to fish. So I know I'm all over the place, but it'll all make sense. So bear with me.
No.
So he'd go fishing and then he'd catch these fish, and they were too pretty to eat. So he would bring them back and he'd put them in his tide pool. Next thing you know, he had this incredible natural aquarium basically in the backyard of his small hotel. And I don't remember the very first case, but the Fish and Wildlife found a turtle that was injured. I think it had been hit by a boat or caught by a lobster trap, and brought it over to Richie because they knew he loved animals, and he cut the line off it, took care of it. And he goes, let me watch it for a couple of days, make sure it's eating before we release it. And he put it in the tide pool with all of his fish. Hence, and that's how the turtle hospital started. Then they brought him another turtle, and then they got some turtles that he could release, but some of them couldn't be released because they were missing flippers or had something wrong with them and they couldn't be released. So he started collecting these turtles. And that was about 2 or 3 years before I first met him back in the early 90s, right after the LA riots. And he said, listen, if you ever move to the Keys, you always have a place to work. Well, what he didn't tell me was he had no money to pay me, but it didn't matter. I moved to the Keys. I started volunteering my time there. And then from that, I started picking up clients like the Key West Aquarium. I started working at Zoo Miami, started working at Dynasty Marine with their sharks, and Theater of the Sea with their dolphins and their turtles. And then my wife, who was also a veterinarian, different one than the one in the book, spoiler alert, she ended up working for one of the local veterinarians in his dog and cat practice. And we got hit by a really nasty, nasty hurricane called Hurricane Georges. And the veterinarian's wife freaked out and said, I can't ever do this again. I'm leaving. You can come with me, or you can stay here by yourself. So the vet said, okay, I'm not going to leave you. So he sold the practice to my wife. And at this point, I was loving doing what I was doing because I was back to my kids' roots, man. I was out playing with turtles and sharks and dolphins and, all sorts of creepy crawlies and fun stuff. And then I was still doing consulting because word had gotten out that this board certified specialist in dog and cat medicine was now living in the Keys. So what I was doing was I was driving up and down the Keys. There were like 10 other vet hospitals. And whenever they had a difficult case, I'd go in and I'd do an ultrasound, or I'd go in and I'd do surgery for them. So I was basically just go in, do the fun stuff, and leave. And then I'd go back and play with my sea turtles. Well, my wife got her practice up and running, and she got really busy and goes, I need you here in the practice helping me. I'm going, I don't want to be back in full-time practice. Well, I got sucked into that. And all of a sudden, having big city medicine, somebody from Los Angeles with specialty degree and all this experience practicing in this little community. But I was a local. I was a Bubba. I lived here. I was born here.
Yeah.
And so people accepted us right away. And we kept our prices incredibly reasonable for the people that lived here. Next thing fast forward many years, we're a 10 doctor, 24-hour a day, specialty practice. So it's amazing how things change. It really is.
And Marathon's kind of in the middle, right?
Right smack in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, because Key Largo is north of you guys, right?
Key Largo is the first island you get to out of Miami.
Yeah.
And then you start driving down the Keys, and then Marathon is in the middle, and then Key West is the very end. And Marathon got its name because when Flagler was building his railroad, it 120 miles, it took them forever. And so when they got halfway down, they said, man, this is like a marathon. And it just so happened that was the island that they were on when he said that, and that's how the name stuck.
Ah, that makes sense. I never heard that story. That's great. Have you worked with manatees at all?
Yeah, yes, I do. It's funny that you say that. I was having this conversation with somebody the other day. All the stuff that I've done with endangered species, you have to have a permit. So, like, when I first moved here, even though I had done a residency in zoo animal medicine, I was a board certified specialist and everything else. If a manatee was in somebody's canal and got wrapped up in fishing line, if I jumped in the water and cut the fishing line off, I could lose my license and be fined.
I know. You can't touch them.
Yeah. And so it took almost just about 20 years to get my manatee permit. So yes, now I am a permitted manatee veterinarian, and there are only a couple dozen in the entire state that are allowed to work with them.
Do you know Pat Rose? Do you know Pat Rose?
Name sounds familiar, but I don't recall.
He was like the director of Save the Manatees.
Mm-hmm.
And so Pat's been on the show, and we talked a lot about that because, back in the day when they first started, I forget what it was called first. It was the governor then that got involved, but they got Jimmy Buffett involved.
Oh yeah,
and he helped raise money for him. And I feel I'm kind of bummed because I always liked Jimmy Buffett, but not a big fan. I'm a much bigger fan now. Unfortunately, that he's gone, and all the great things that he did to help all Florida, really, but especially down there in the Keys.
I'll tell you, man, he's a saint down here. When he passed away, the whole island went in mourning. They were flying flags at half mast. They now have an official Jimmy Buffett Day. They're talking about renaming the highway, the highway that I talked about, to the Jimmy Buffett Highway.
We should.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they don't do it.
Oh, that would be great. That I know we're totally digressing, but that's typical me. But they did that big music event for him, and Zach Brown wrote this book. I forget, it's called Pirate something or another. It's a great song. It's a tribute to him because he got to know him really well, and for the family and that. It was just really great song. But we're digressing. So you have worked on manatees, but so now you're still down there. You've got the biggest practice down there.
Well, actually, jumping ahead, I actually sold the practice a couple years ago. We had it for 27 years.
Okay.
And now I'm back to just doing wildlife work. So I work with fish and wildlife. I'm doing manatees. I'm doing key deer, sea turtles, crocodiles, alligators. They have a little rabbit here called the marsh rabbit, and it's actually named after Hugh Hefner.
Uh-huh.
I love the way the world comes together. Hugh Hefner, I'm sure you know who he is. He's the master of the Playboy Mansion, right? The Playboy magazine.
Yeah. Pajamas.
There's a very rare endangered rabbit here called the marsh rabbit. And way back when they were first studying it, they applied for a grant. And I don't know how it happened, but Hugh Hefner paid for the entire funding of the studies of this rabbit many, many, many years ago.
Because it was a bunny.
It's a bunny rabbit.
Yeah.
So they named it, it's Civilagus is the genus, which is the common rabbit that we find in the United States, but it's Civilagus hefneri. So it was actually named after Hugh Hefner.
You're kidding. That's hilarious.
Yeah.
That's so funny. So are there snakes down on the Keys?
We do. We have a lot of colubrid snakes, which are the non-venomous ones. And some of the islands actually have the venomous ones. We have the eastern diamondback. We have the pygmy rattlesnake, the water moccasin. And then I have never seen one, but I have seen pictures of them up in Key Largo. There are coral snakes. Fortunately, where we live, on the island we live on, we don't have them. And even the water moccasins, which are clearly they're a water snake, we've never seen one on our island, but some of the other islands have them. And the entire time that we had our hospital, because we were an emergency hospital 24 hours a day,
Mhm.
We only had 3 snake bites the entire 30 years or 27 years we were. And the funny thing is that 2 of the snake bites were the same dog. So it didn't learn its lesson.
Huh. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, do water moccasins go in salt water?
Yep, they sure do.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought they were only freshwater.
No, no, they'll swim in the salt water. You see them in the mangroves,
Yeah.
in the brackish, especially in the brackish water around the edges of the islands.
Well, they're protected there too. I live in Austin. By the way, I was thinking about when you were talking about Davis being the Harvard. Don't tell anybody that at Texas A&M because they're going to tell you the same thing. It's pretty funny.
Well, anytime they wanna sit down and and hash it out, I'll be happy to show them the statistics.
So the 4 I know, well, they'll be the happy ones to try to argue well, and of course, when you live in Texas, and again, coming from California, you live in Texas, everybody that's originally from Texas, everything's better in Texas, of
Oh,
course.
absolutely.
But you've got A&M, you've got Davis, you've got, CSU, Colorado, and what's the one in the East Coast? The big one is
Cornell.
Cornell. So
Well,
the
Cornell in New York, and then the one in Florida here is University of Florida Gators.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah. So, but let's talk about some of the crazy cases you've had because I mean, I don't know, when I go into vet clinics, the most exotic animal typically I'll see is a chicken or a rooster or something. I don't see
Mhm.
gators and snakes and all the stuff that you're doing. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because I'm sure the audience would love to hear some stories about some of those things.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I've been extremely Mark, I've been really blessed in my career that I've had the opportunity to work with so many different animals. And, that's kinda how the hospital in the book got its name, Noah's Ark, because, bring 2 of every type.
Right.
Literally, we had clients that used to come in with older ladies. We call them LOLs, little old ladies. It was before LOL meant what? Laugh out loud.
Yeah. 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 That's funny.
So we used to call them the LOLs. They'd come in literally with their knitting, and they would just sit in one of the seats in the reception area and knit and talk to the other people and just watch all the animals that would come in. They just got a big kick out of that. It's like, yeah, sure, you can come in and watch. So yeah, we've had a lot of things. I mean, lions and tigers and bears. Um, I think probably the craziest house call I ever made. I got a call one day from an LOL, a little old lady, and she had a Congo fire eel in her bathtub. She'd had it there for 16 years. Her grandson had purchased it at a pet store, and this is an eel from South America.
Right.
And then when he went to college, he didn't want to take it to college with him, so the grandma said, "I'll take it," and it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So she set it up in the bathtub, and she had a whole aquatic setup in the bathtub with filters and everything else, and she just loved this eel to death. And actually, that's a really bad analogy. She loved this eel like crazy. And she called one day, and this is when I was at the vet school working there, and said, my eel's not eating properly, and can you bring it in? No, I can't because I'm a little old lady, and this is a huge eel. So I grabbed a couple of students. We drove out to her house, and sure enough, there's this Congo fire eel, this beautiful brown animal with these flaming orange and red stripes down its side. Looks like somebody had painted fire stripes on an old car, living in the bathtub. And that's where it lived, and she fed it, and she loved that animal to death. Talk about the human animal bond. I mean, she really cared about that animal.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it had gone into heart failure. Now, how do I know that? I don't really. Um, we did our exam on it, and we actually even ultrasounded this animal. We looked at the heart,
Wow.
and it's not like I've got a ton of data on Congo fire eel hearts that I could compare it with. I think that was the only one that I had ever seen at that time, and since then, I may have seen one or two more in the last 30 years or 35 years. But everything pointed toward heart failure. So we had talked about trying to treat it. I mean, she'd had it 16 years, and it was almost an adult when she got it. They don't live that long. They live 20 to 30 years. So it was near the end of its use by date. It was getting pretty close. So we had asked her, I said, it's not eating. Normally we could maybe hide a pill in the shrimp or something and get it to eat, but it wouldn't eat. And we said, well, are you willing to try and give it an injection of some medication? And she, oh, I can't poke it with a needle. So, we said, well, and this was a long drive. It was like an hour and a half to get to her house. So it wasn't like a student could drive out there every day and treat it for her. So
Right.
we says, maybe, if it's okay with you, we'll take the eel back to the hospital. We'll set it up in a really nice, comfortable cage or tank, and we'll see if we can treat the heart failure. And then when it's strong, we'll send it home. Once it's eating, you can give it food and hide the pills in the food. She goes, okay, that's all right. And she goes, it's going to be fine, right? And I said, I can't make promises. I says, but we'll do everything we can. Well, unfortunately, you know how the story goes. It passed away,
Right.
and she was devastated.
Of course.
That's one patient I will never ever forget, and it's just I felt like such a failure.
Well, yeah, but the poor thing's living in a bathtub. I always think I mean, I'm sure she gave it a lot of love, but can you imagine being an eel living in a bathtub?
Well, I mean, what else did it know though?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, it doesn't. It's not like it probably came from some river in Colombia, and then all of a sudden was put in a bathtub and goes, "Oh, I miss my river." So, I mean, that was its life, and she gave it the best life possible. Now, am I endorsing that? Absolutely not.
Yeah, of course not.
That's not the message here. The message here is, this woman,
Connection.
the connection. She loved that animal.
Sure.
She loved it, and she lost it. That's one that I'll always remember. That went south, which sadly, like I said, sometimes they do. You can't save them all. But I think one of my other favorite cases that I ever had a little better ending. And up in Marathon, between Marathon and Grassy Key, there's a very narrow channel called Vaca Cut. And it's funny because when the tide changes, the current blows through this channel sometimes 6-8 knots.
Wow.
I mean, you can literally drive across the bridge or walk over the bridge, and you can see the current rushing through there like rapids on a river. And when you're on a small boat, you have to time yourself so that you kind of go with the current. Otherwise, the current can kind of take a small boat and push it off into the mangroves. So it can be real dangerous.
Right.
What was really interesting, because there was a whale shark. You know what they are? They're the largest
Sure.
fish. I mean, they call them a shark, but they're actually just a big fish. And this one was a baby, so it was about 25 feet long, and they get much, much bigger than that. But it was about 25 feet long, and somehow it had figured out that if it parked itself underneath the bridge in this channel, because the current would be whipping by at around 6 knots,
Bring all the food to it.
all it had to do was open its mouth, because they're filter feeders.
Yeah.
And it just sat there under the bridge, and the current would blow through, and it would open its mouth and filter feed. During slack tide, it would swim out from under the bridge, turn around, and then face in the other direction, and then catch all the stuff filtering back in the other direction. And it became a huge tourist attraction. I mean, to the point where they had to have police on the bridge and stuff to stop people from parking on the bridge and taking pictures and everything,
Sure.
because everybody wanted to see this giant whale shark. Well, all of a sudden, one day, somebody noticed that the whale shark was dragging a long rope with a lobster trap on the end of it. So somehow, during one of its turnarounds, it had gotten tangled up in a lobster trap. And that's a death sentence to anything like a sea lion or a dolphin or anything, or a sea turtle. If you get a rope or something wrapped around a flipper,
Mm-hmm.
because it cuts off the blood supply, and then it's going to kill the flipper.
Sure.
So this rope had wrapped around the tail of this whale shark, and it's like, oh my God, if we don't get this thing off there, that it's going to kill the tail, because this animal's so young and growing.
Yeah, this tiny little 25-foot fish.
Yeah. And so Fish and Wildlife called me and said, are you willing to come out and help us try and catch this animal? Not catch it, and come out and try and get this rope off. Instead of, yeah, force me. So I went out there, and one of the local dive shops donated a boat, and we went out, and the visibility in that channel can be either crystal clear, or it can be like pea soup.
Right.
And on that particular day, it was like pea soup. It's just like, oh my God, we can't see anything. And every once in a while, you'd see the dorsal fin pop up. And you go, there it is. And then you'd zip over there in the boat, but then the sound of the boat would scare it, and it would go down. And it was probably 20, 30 feet deep in the channel. So eventually we saw it, and we went over to where it was. And I was only wearing a snorkel. I didn't have a tank on. And I had flippers, and I had my knife. And we saw it, and the boat just basically threw me overboard. And I just started swimming. And next thing I know, I bump into something, and it's like, oh my God, that's the whale. So I see all these big spots, because these are beautiful dark fish covered with white spots. And so I figure, okay, the rope is at the tail, so I'm just going to let this thing slide under my hands, which, by the way, they're like sandpaper. And I wasn't wearing gloves. So I kind of slid down, kept sliding down, felt the dorsal fin, slid past the dorsal fin, kept sliding down. I finally grabbed the tail, and son of a gun, there was the rope. So, from the tail to the dorsal fin, I couldn't see the dorsal fin. That's how cloudy the water was. but I just started cutting and cutting and cutting. And then he didn't like the fact that I was hanging on his back, so he started diving down. But I figured there's no way I'm going to let go of him because I'm never going to see this guy again.
Right.
He's going to take off and he's going to lose his tail. So I kept cutting and cutting and cutting. I finally got all the rope off. And then I said, okay, I'm out of breath. Got to swim to the surface. I looked up. I couldn't see the surface. And I figured, okay, just let the gas bubbles carry me up.
Sure.
So I started going up and up and up and up. And then they had this thing called shallow water blackout. And that's where people dive too deep
Sure.
and they run out of air.
Yeah.
And I'm getting to the point where I'm getting closer and closer to the surface and I can start to see the sun peeking through. But I'm thinking, okay, now it's starting to get dark. And I realized I'm running out of air. But I finally made it to the surface.
Yeah.
And I honest to God, I didn't know I was going to make it, but I wasn't about to let that whale or that whale shark get away. And
Yeah.
that is, that was a happy ending. So that's another one that I'll never forget because that one actually worked out on the good side.
Well, those are the things you remember for your entire life. I mean, that's really cool. So, I know we're gonna run out of time here, but can you give me either, because you guys are down there, a gator or a crocodile story? Because that to me, I can't imagine working on one of those things.
Yeah, I do. I've got a couple of big alligator farms I work with, and let me clarify that. When I say alligator farms, these are not farms where they raise alligators and slaughter them for meat and hides.
Sure.
I won't. That's me. I'm sorry. I won't do that. They call them alligator farms because it attracts the tourists, and these are actually USDA licensed zoos. And because they're USDA licensed zoos, they are not allowed to kill anything.
Right.
So they're called alligator farms. Well, one's called an alligator farm. The other one's called the alligator outpost. So they don't kill anything. So just so your listeners realize, I'm not working at a facility that kills alligators. So I take care of hundreds of those every year. But I also, if Fish and Wildlife has an alligator or a crocodile that's hit by a car, because unfortunately they do, they crisscross the road, and occasionally cars will hit them. So I get to work on those. And I think probably the most famous one actually went worldwide, and it was called Robocroc. It was an American crocodile that was crossing the 18-mile stretch on the southernmost part of the Everglades, hit by a big 18-wheeler and got his skull crushed.
Ooh.
And it was taken up to Zoo Miami, and they called me. So I went up there and I packed up I love surgery. I packed up all my orthopedic equipment. I went up there and I ended up about a 4-hour surgery, and I put 4 plates, and I want to say it was something like 60 or 70 screws in his head, and completely rebuilt his head with all these metal plates. And then the zoo spokesperson, Ron McGill, decided to call it RoboCroc because here was this crocodile. He was about probably 11, 12 feet long with all of this metal on his head. And then he put out a press release, vet from the Keys saves RoboCroc. The next thing I know, I am literally getting phone calls from Japan, Australia, Germany, all over the world wanting to interview me about this crocodile.
I'll bet.
That was the good news, that surgically everything went really well. Unfortunately, a while down, later, he ended up passing away from some other chronic internal injuries. But that was pretty amazing because to work on an endangered species like that is always something that you just take a lot of pride in.
Sure. So when you sedate them, do you have to do with a dart or something? How does that work?
There's different ways. When I work with the crocodiles and the alligators, I always work with a team that are professionals,
Uh-huh.
and you have to work as a team because if I'm focusing on, let's say, sewing up a wound on on an alligator's leg, I'm not watching the tail, I'm not watching the claws, I'm not watching the eyes and the face, and I need a team that I can count on that they're going to control that animal so that I don't lose my head.
Uh-huh.
And generally, most of the time, the people I work with, I mean, I've had some 14-footers where they've been able to hand catch them, and they do it by using nooses, and then they carefully close the mouth, and then they grab the tail,
Right.
and then they'll wrap up the legs so they can control it. And you can put them in the tonic immobility most of the time and do what you have to do. If I have to sedate them, yes, I use sedatives on them, especially if they need surgery. They have to have anesthesia.
Right.
So it's something that is just it's a skill and something that you learn over the years by doing a lot of them, and then of course reading and talking to other experts around the world.
Well, there can't be that many experts that are experts on crocodiles and caimans and alligators, I would think.
Probably not more than a couple dozen worldwide that work with on a regular basis.
Yeah. Well, I know you're also working with the key deer. Can you tell people that don't live in Florida a little bit about them and what you're doing to keep them around?
Yeah, the key deer are a subspecies of the white-tailed deer. But what's unique about them is that, eons ago, they migrated down from the Everglades, across the Gulf of Florida, maybe when there were still land bridges. Nobody really quite knows how they got down into the Keys, but then they've kind of evolved their own subspecies. And a full-grown key deer, a full-grown male buck, is about the size of a greyhound.
Right,
So they're tiny little things. They're the smallest North American ungulate. Population wise, they don't have exact numbers. They estimate it to be around 800 to 1,000. They've taken a couple big hits over the years. About 10 years ago, we had an invasion of screwworm, which is a parasite that has been eradicated in the United States since the early 60s. They don't know where it came from. They think it may have come up from Cuba, but it got into the key deer population and just started wiping them out left and right. We got through that. And then 6 years ago, we had Hurricane Irma. Hurricane Irma was a Cat 5, and it brought through tidal surges up to 20 feet. And so a lot of the deer drowned. Fortunately, the deer float. And so many of them just kind of got into the current and got blown to a different part of the island or to a different island.
right,
But the population has come back nice and strong, and so the animals that we have, it's part of nature, Mark. It's the way it works, survival of the fittest.
right.
So it kind of weeds out the less genetically healthy ones. So we've got a really healthy population right now, knock on wood. And so again, it was one of these endangered species. It took me many years to get a permit to work on them, and I'm the only private veterinarian outside of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that's allowed to work on these animals. And so I work with them, their wildlife. So sometimes I have maybe 2 or 3 calls a week. Sometimes I may go a couple of weeks between calls, but I do what I can to try and keep them going. And they're cool little animals.
I know I've seen them. They're little tiny things. I know you and your wife have your after you sold the practice, you have your new services, and that's that mainly for exotic animals. What's that called again?
It's Tropical Veterinary Services, and actually, she was trained in Zurich but grew up in Hong Kong, and if I drop dead tonight, she could take over and do everything that I do. She's really talented, far smarter than I am. But her main focus is traditional Chinese medicine.
Oh wow.
So she is a veterinarian, licensed veterinarian, but she's also certified in Eastern medicine. So she does a lot of acupuncture, herbal medicine, and holistic medicine, things like that. So she has her boutique client base where she takes care of that type of a client. And then 90% of what I do is the wildlife and the aquarium and the alligators. And then 10% of my life, I'm just trying to get the second book written, working on the sequel.
Oh, good. So, what I love about veterinarian, and I for the listeners out there, and this is not anything traditional veterinary medicine is great, but integrative veterinary medicine, I tend to lean towards mainly because most people know I've got that stem cell thing. But when you combine Eastern and Western medicine, it gives you more options to do other
Oh, it
things.
sure does. And she actually uses some of her Eastern medicine on a lot of the exotics.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, there have been many a sea turtle. I mean, we even had a mass stranding of pilot whales one time, and we had some problems with basically they get cramping when they're in captivity because these are pelagic animals that swim miles and miles every day.
Mhm.
Then you put them in captivity to try and rehab them, they cramp. So she was doing acupuncture on these whales. I mean, she's like I said, she's incredible. She does a lot of really amazing things, and she's able to use the integrated medicine with the exotics.
Yeah, that's cool. So, what's funny is I was thinking while you're talking, I had somebody on recently that works with the Florida Panther Refuge. And I mean, and they were endangered, and it's amazing how many animals are endangered, but it's always because of humans. It's like the manatees at some point and all that stuff too. It's crazy.
Yeah, it sure is. And the humans that make the effort to try and bring them back, and again, the American alligator is a classic example. I mean, they were hunted almost to extinction, and now they're back to the point where they're almost a nuisance.
Yeah, yeah.
But we have the issue with the American crocodile. There are very few of those left. And right now, I'm sure you've heard about it. The big issue in the Keys is the small-tooth sawfish, which is a highly, highly endangered
Yeah.
elasmobranch, which is related to sharks and rays. And something is causing them to die. And my wife and I are both on the team, which consists of many very educated people from all around the country trying to figure out what's going on and why these animals are dying.
Well, if I was going to guess, based on my experience of talking to so many people that deal with endangered species, it has something to do with us. I don't.
Actually, I think in this case, we really don't know. The honest answer is we don't know yet, but
Yeah.
everything is leaning towards some kind of a biotoxin
Oh,
and not a human-made
well, that's good.
chemical, because that's easy to find. That's a piece of cake nowadays with all of the sophistication that we have in diagnostics. But it appears to be a biotoxin, and it appears actually to be a cocktail of several different biotoxins.
Hmm.
And the fear is that these toxins are being produced from an algae that are proliferating because of global warming.
Yeah, well,
So, yes, there is, if you connect the dots, it's probably related to humans, but it's not directly like effluent from, big sugar or something like that.
right. So one last thing, just I was thinking when we were talking, when you were working with the zebras, and I know you spent some time in Africa. Do you know what the Swahili word is for zebra? It's one of my favorite words in Swahili.
I'm sure if you told me, I'll remember.
Punda Malaya. And you know what it means?
No.
Because if you've been in like Kenya, they're all over the place. Donkey with stripes.
I love it.
It's a great name. It's one of my favorite. Punda Malaya.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to get to the joke that everybody's going to cringe about here, but let's talk a little bit so everybody can dare, because I want everybody to know where they can get your book. Tell them the title again, how they can find out about everything, because I haven't had a chance to read it. I was hoping it would be an ebook.
It is.
Oh, it is now.
It's an ebook, and it's also an Audible as well.
Oh, when I looked for it before we were doing this thing, I couldn't find it because that's how I read. I read late at night, so I'm in bed and I don't want to have a light on. So I'll definitely download it so I can read it. So tell everybody where to find it, the title again, and everything else.
The book is called The Vet at Noah's Ark: Stories of Survival from an Inner City Animal Hospital. It's published by Apollo Publishers, and you can get it at any of your major booksellers like B. Dalton. But for most people, the easiest way to pick it up is just go to Amazon. And if you just type in The Vet at Noah's Ark, it's the first thing to pop up. It's an Amazon bestseller. I've been very humbled at how well it's done. So it's exciting, and I am working on a sequel. You can also visit my website, which is my name, www.dougmader.com. And you can watch a trailer about the book. You can read some excerpts from the book. You can read some blurbs that other authors have put on there. Carl Hyacin, who's done a lot of work with wildlife in Florida, he fell in love with the book, and he has some really nice things to say about it. So I appreciate the opportunity to let me share that with the readers, and I hope you all enjoy it.
Well, I can tell you one thing. I'm going to read it, and I'll send you a message now. I've got that thing. So we're to that point where I tell an animal joke, a silly dad's animal joke. So I'm going to ask you this joke because it'll be a little bit related to you, and I know you probably haven't heard them, so just get ready to cringe. And for everybody out there, please just smile along with the pain. So here's my joke for you. It's a question. How do you tell the difference between an alligator and a crocodile?
I've heard that, but I'll let you share the punchline.
One you see later, and the other you see in a while. See you later, crocodile.
That's a dad joke.
Yeah, oh, it's totally me. And there's a big story behind that. I'll tell you another time. But anyways, everybody that's out there listening, as I say every time, I'm sure you've got a better joke. And if you want one of your kids to tell the joke, I would really welcome that, or a friend or whatever. And you can send me an email at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com, mkyle@forrealpodcast.com. Please send it in, because as you know, every time you hear it, you're thinking, man, I wish you quit telling them. So if we can find somebody else to tell it, or if you want to tell one, that'd be great. And also, if you've got a great subject for us, please send me an email, because of course I'll do the research and we can certainly get that on. And for everybody out there, first of all, Doug, thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Mark.
Well, it's really been enjoyable for me. And for everybody else out there, please pass the word, keep following, have other people listen. And really, I appreciate everybody from the bottom of my heart, for real. We're supported by Let's Walk, that's here to love your animals like our own.
Austin, Houston, and Denver. Let's Walk is here to love your animals like our own. From daily walks, play, in-house sleepovers, and more. Go to work, out on the town, or take a vacation knowing your pets are in the best hands. This woman-owned small business does it all. Check us out on Instagram at Let's Walk Austin, Houston, and Denver.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.